She locked my gate, put up her own sign, started charging $50 a day for people to access my beach. My beach. 800 feet of ocean front that my grandfather bought in 1958, passed down through 3 generations, documented in a deed I keep in a fireproof safe. Elizabeth Flores, president of the Coastal Haven HOA, thought she could take what was mine and turn it into her personal cash machine. She thought I would just pay her fees and stay quiet. She was wrong. I woke early that Saturday morning in June, the way I always did when the ocean called. The salt air drifted through my bedroom window, carrying the rhythm of waves breaking against the shore just 200 yards from my back door. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because if you live in any HOA community near water, this story might sound painfully familiar. I gathered my beach chair, a small cooler with sandwiches and cold water, and the brass key that had unlocked my family's beach gate for 65 years. The path through the dunes was the same one my grandfather had walked when he first bought this land. The same one my father had carried me down as a child. The same one I had maintained with my own hands since inheriting the property 8 years ago. The cedar gate at the end stood weathered and familiar, its wood silvered by decades of salt and sun. But something was different. Something was wrong. A padlock hung from the latch, new, shiny, industrial grade. Not mine. I stood there for a long moment, my key useless in my hand, staring at this foreign object attached to my property. The absurdity of it hit me first. Then the anger, slow and hot, rising from my chest, beside the gate. Someone had driven a metal stake into the sand and attached a laminated sign. The words were crisp and official-looking: Coastal Haven Beach Access, HOA members only, guest fee $50 per day, parking $25, contact HOA office. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands steady despite the fury building inside me. Then I called the number on the sign. Elizabeth Flores answered on the 3rd ring, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Oh, Mr. Cole. We sent notices about the new beach access standardization. You will need to register for a membership card and pay the annual fee like everyone else." I kept my voice level, though it cost me effort. "This is my gate, Mrs. Flores, on my property, leading to my beach." Her tone shifted, hardening beneath the sugar. "The beachfront is a community asset. Mr. Cole, the HOA has management authority under state regulations. If you are unhappy, you can attend next month's meeting." I asked the only question that mattered. "Do you have a deed showing the HOA owns this beach?" Silence. Then, "I do not need to explain HOA authority to you. The rules are the rules." She hung up. I walked back to my house, past the garden my late wife had planted, past the porch where I had spent countless evenings watching the sun sink into the Atlantic. Inside. I opened the fireproof safe in my study, the same safe where my grandfather had kept his important documents, where my father had added his, where I now stored the accumulated paperwork of 3 generations. The deed was there, yellowed but legible, dated 1958, bearing my grandfather's signature and the careful legal language of a different era. I read the critical passage slowly, including all literal rights, the entirety of the oceanfront measuring 800 linear feet from the mean high water mark, the beach access path, and all structures thereon in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Forever. The beach was mine. The gate was mine. The path was mine. The HOA had no claim to any of it. I photographed the deed and began a file on my computer, labeling it with the date and a simple title, Flores Beach Access Dispute. I did not know then that this file would grow to contain hundreds of documents, or that it would eventually bring down the entire corrupt structure Elizabeth Flores had built. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not going to pay anyone for the right to walk on my own land. That afternoon, I drove slowly along the oceanfront road that wound through Coastal Haven Estates. What I saw made my stomach tighten. 5 identical signs stood at intervals along the beach, all bearing the same HOA logo, the same fee structure, the same official-looking authority. Near the main beach entrance, a small wooden booth had been constructed, staffed by a young man in a polo shirt embroidered with Coastal Haven HOA Beach Patrol. I stopped and asked when the booth had been built. "About a month ago," he said cheerfully. "Mrs. Flores said we needed to manage the summer tourists." Through the open window of the booth, I could see a cash box, a card reader, and a logbook filled with entries. Money was flowing in. The question was, where was it flowing out? I took more photographs, noted the time and location in my phone, and drove home. The investigation had begun the following Monday. I drove to the HOA office and requested a copy of the current CCNRs. The assistant at the desk handed me a photocopied document without meeting my eyes, her gaze flickering nervously toward the back office. At home. I spread it beside my original CCNRs from 2005 and found what I expected to find. Section 14.3, titled Oceanfront Management Authority, claimed the HOA had the right to manage and collect fees for all beach access points within the community. This section did not exist in my original document. Someone had fabricated it and inserted it into the governing documents without a membership vote. I circled the fraudulent section in red ink and added it to my growing file. The Dare County Register of Deeds office confirmed the scope of the deception. I spent 3 hours tracing ownership records for every oceanfront property in Coastal Haven Estates. My deed from 1958 granted me 800 feet of beachfront with full literal rights in perpetuity. 4 other families held similar deeds for their portions of the shoreline, each predating the HOA by decades. The critical discovery was what I did not find. Not a single document showed any transfer of beach property to the association. The HOA owned the clubhouse, the pool, and the tennis courts. They did not own 1 inch of that beach. I paid $45 for certified copies of everything and drove home with proof that Elizabeth Flores had been collecting money for land she had no legal claim to. That evening, I visited Eleanor Vance, a neighbor who had been friends with my grandfather since the 1960s. We sat on her porch with glasses of sweet tea while the evening light turned the ocean gold at 67. Eleanor remembered things that newcomers like Elizabeth Flores would never understand. "Your grandfather bought that land from the McAllister family in '58, she said. "Fishermen, 3 generations deep. He paid fair price, and they shook hands before the lawyers ever got involved. Elizabeth Flores moved here 12 years ago from Raleigh. Thinks she owns the place because she runs the HOA. I asked if Elizabeth had demanded beach fees from her. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Sent me a letter last month wanting $300 a year. I have 60 feet of oceanfront in my own deed." "Nathan, I threw that letter where it belonged." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But most folks do not know any better. At least 25 families have been paying those fees, maybe more. They think it is the law." 25 families, perhaps more. All were paying for access to land they already owned or that belonged to their neighbors. The money had to be going somewhere, armed with this information. I returned to the HOA office on Wednesday and requested a meeting with Elizabeth Flores directly. She kept me waiting 45 minutes this time, longer than before. A petty power play designed to remind me of my place when she finally emerged. There was no smile, no pretense of warmth. Her jaw was set, her posture rigid, her eyes assessing me like a threat to be neutralized. "What do you want?" "Mr. Cole." The sweetness from our phone call had evaporated entirely. I matched her directness. "I want to see the meeting minutes where the membership voted to approve Section 14.3 of the CCNRs, the Oceanfront Management Authority provision." Something shifted in her face, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible clench of her hands. That is an internal administrative matter. The board handles such things. I noted her choice of words. The board, not the membership. Under the North Carolina Nonprofit Corporation Act, Section 55-1602, I have the legal right to inspect all meeting minutes within 5 business days of a written request. If you refuse, I will file a motion in court to compel disclosure. She took a step toward me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, her voice low and hard. You are making a mistake, Mr. Cole. A very expensive mistake. People who cause problems in this community find that life becomes complicated. I placed my written request on her desk, dated and signed, and held her gaze without flinching. 5 business days, Mrs. Flores, I will be counting. I turned and walked out. Behind me, I heard her snatch the paper from the desk. Her voice followed me down the hallway, sharp and barely controlled. You have no idea what you are starting. But I did. I knew exactly what I was starting, and I had no intention of stopping. 2 weeks after my confrontation with Elizabeth Flores, I drove 2 hours to Raleigh to meet Marcus Webb, an attorney whose name appeared repeatedly in coastal property disputes across North Carolina. His office walls displayed framed newspaper clippings of cases he had won, most involving waterfront owners fighting government overreach or developer fraud. He was 44 years old, sharp-featured, with the calm intensity of someone who had spent 2 decades navigating the intersection of property law and human greed. I spread my documents across his conference table and watched his expression shift from professional interest to something harder as he reviewed each page. When he finished examining my deed, he looked up with a thin smile. Literal rights in perpetuity. This is the strongest property language in coastal law. Mr. Cole, you own that beach forever. The HOA has no authority whatsoever. He tapped the fraudulent CC&Rs section with his pen. But this is where it gets interesting. If they have been collecting fees for access to land they do not own, that is not just a civil matter. That is fraud. Class H felony under North Carolina law. Marcus helped me draft a formal request for the HOA's complete financial records. Citing North Carolina General Statute 55A-1620, which grants members the right to inspect association accounting books. We sent it by certified mail with a 14-day deadline. Elizabeth Flores let the deadline pass without a response. On day 15, Marcus sent a follow-up letter warning of court action. The financial records arrived on day 17, delivered by a nervous courier who avoided eye contact. That evening, Marcus and I sat in his office with cold coffee and a stack of documents that revealed the full scope of what Elizabeth Flores had built. Beach access revenue for the previous year totaled $67,000. Parking fees added another $28,000. Guest passes brought in $19,000. Special event beach rentals contributed $12,000 more. The total was $126,000 collected for access to oceanfront property that the HOA did not own. But the expenditure side told the darker story. Beach maintenance contract, $45,000, paid to Flores Construction, a company owned by Rick Flores, Elizabeth's husband. Walkway repairs, $22,000, also paid to Flores Construction. Administrative fees, $15,000, paid directly to Elizabeth Flores personally. Beach patrol wages accounted for $18,000 more. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. They collected $126,000 for access to property they have no claim to, then funneled $67,000 of it to their own family business and personal accounts. This is self-dealing, a breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially embezzlement. We have them. I thought of Eleanor's words about the 25 families who had been paying these fees for years, believing it was the law. I thought of the elderly couples who had been told that state regulations had changed, that they had no choice. The anger I felt was cold and precise, the kind that demanded not revenge, but justice. Over the following week, I contacted other beachfront property owners whose names I had found in the Register of Deeds records. The stories they told painted a picture of systematic deception. The Patterson family owned 120 feet of oceanfront and had been paying fees for 4 years because they did not want trouble with their neighbors. The Evans family had found their private gate padlocked one morning, and Elizabeth told them it was a new safety regulation after hurricane season. The Rodriguez family had been fined $1,800 for refusing to comply with the beach access policy. Money they paid because they could not afford a lawyer. And the Williams family, both 78 years old, had been told by Elizabeth herself that state law had changed, and they were required to pay annual fees despite owning their beachfront since 1972. Each conversation added weight to the file. Each story revealed another family who had been lied to, pressured, or simply worn down into compliance. I sat on my porch that night, watching the moon rise over the ocean I could not legally access because of a lock that had no right to exist. I could have simply cut the lock, removed the signs, and reclaimed what was mine. No court would have faulted me, but 25 families or more had been defrauded. $126,000 a year was flowing into pockets it did not belong in. My grandfather had taught me that the beach was a legacy, but the true legacy was how you treated your neighbors. I called Marcus the next morning. I want to file suit, not just for myself, for everyone who has been paying these illegal fees. Marcus paused before responding. That means going public, press coverage, community attention. Elizabeth Flores will fight back hard. I looked out at the ocean, at the beach my grandfather had walked, at the gate I could not open. Then we go public, and we make sure everyone knows exactly what she has been doing. The next call I made was to the Outer Banks Gazette. Alexis Peterson was 35 years old, a journalist with the Outer Banks Gazette who had spent 2 years investigating HOA complaints across the coastal region. We met at a coffee shop overlooking the harbor, and I handed her the file I had built over the past month. She reviewed each document with the methodical attention of someone who understood that evidence was everything. When she finished, she looked up with controlled anger in her eyes. I have 6 complaints about Coastal Haven HOA in the Better Business Bureau files, she said, but nobody has ever brought me financial records like this. The contracts to her husband's company, the payments to herself. This is not just a story. Mr. Cole, this is a pattern of criminal fraud. She asked if I was prepared for what would happen when the article went public. I told her I was prepared for whatever it took to stop Elizabeth Flores from stealing from her neighbors. The article appeared online the following Thursday with a headline that spread through the community like wildfire. Beach lockout. HOA president accused of collecting fees for private land she does not own. Alexis had traced every financial connection, interviewed 6 residents who had paid illegal fees, and obtained commentary from a Duke University property law professor who confirmed that literal rights in North Carolina were constitutionally protected. The article included photographs of the fee signs, the padlocked gates, the wooden booth where cash was collected daily. Elizabeth Flores had declined to comment. Her silence spoke louder than any denial could have. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared thousands of times across community forums throughout the Outer Banks. My phone began ringing with calls from residents I had never met, all wanting to know if they had been paying fees they never owed. The community was waking up. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Elizabeth had called it to address what she termed malicious misinformation. Marcus Webb accompanied me, and we arrived early to secure seats in the front row. The room filled beyond capacity within minutes. More than 150 people crowded into a space designed for half that number, folding chairs lining the walls, bodies pressing into doorways, the air thick with humid tension and barely contained fury. Elizabeth stood at the podium flanked by her husband Rick and Vice President Kevin Marsh. Her composure was cracking before she even spoke, visible in the white knuckles gripping the lectern. "There are individuals in this community," she began, her voice strained, "who are attempting to destroy everything we have built together with lies and distortions." Mr. Williams rose before she could continue. 78 years old, leaning on his cane, his voice trembling but audible to everyone. "You told me state law had changed. You told me I had to pay. Was that a lie?" Mrs. Evans stood across the room before Elizabeth could answer. "Why was my gate padlocked? That is my property." The room erupted, questions overlapping, accusations flying, neighbors turning to neighbors with dawning recognition. I waited for a moment of relative quiet, then stood and faced Elizabeth directly. "Mrs. Flores, I have certified deeds for 15 oceanfront properties here, all with literal rights. Section 14.3 of the current CCNRs does not exist in the original 1995 document. It was added without a membership vote, in violation of state law." I did not need to explain further. The murmurs spreading through the crowd told me they understood. Elizabeth's face cycled through white, then crimson. "You are a troublemaker," she spat, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You want to destroy this community." Rick Flores grabbed her arm and pulled her back from the podium. "Elizabeth, stop. Not another word. We need our lawyer." But the confession was already written on their faces. Eleanor Vance rose in the back of the room, her voice cutting through the chaos with 55 years of authority behind it. "I have lived here since 1968. I know who owns what beach, and I know who has been lying to us." The applause began slowly, then built into something thunderous, rolling through the room like the waves outside. Elizabeth snatched her purse and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Rick close behind. Kevin Marsh stammered something about adjourning, but no one heard him. They were too busy turning to each other, comparing stories, connecting the dots of a scheme that had stolen from them for years. I remained in my seat as the room slowly emptied, watching the community transform in real time. Neighbors who had never spoken were exchanging phone numbers. Elderly couples who had paid thousands in fraudulent fees were learning they were not alone. The machine Elizabeth Flores had built was coming apart, not because of any single blow, but because the truth had finally been spoken aloud in a room full of people ready to hear it. Marcus leaned over and spoke quietly. "The Attorney General's office and the sheriff will want to see everything we have. This is going to move fast now." I nodded, watching the last stragglers file out into the warm night air. Fast was exactly what I wanted. The legal consequences arrived swiftly in the weeks that followed. The North Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division opened a formal investigation into deceptive trade practices within 72 hours of receiving our complaint. The Dare County Sheriff's Office launched a parallel criminal inquiry into potential fraud and embezzlement. A judge granted an emergency motion to freeze all HOA accounts pending the outcome of both investigations. Elizabeth and Rick Flores retained criminal defense attorneys from Raleigh, their confident public faces replaced by the tight-lipped silence of people who understood they were in serious trouble. Marcus Webb filed our civil lawsuit in Dare County Superior Court, naming the HOA, Elizabeth Flores personally, Rick Flores, and Flores Construction as defendants. The charges included trespassing, conversion of property, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment. We sought damages for myself and class action relief for every resident who had paid illegal beach fees. The resolution came faster than anyone expected, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a very public trial. The HOA's insurance carrier pressured the board to settle before the case reached a courtroom. The terms were comprehensive. The association agreed to refund $189,000 in illegally collected fees to all affected residents over the previous 4 years. I received $35,000 in personal damages and attorney fees. A permanent injunction prohibited the HOA from ever again charging fees or restricting access to any privately owned beachfront property. All signs were to be removed and all locks released within 7 days. The criminal investigation concluded 3 months later. Elizabeth Flores pleaded guilty to obtaining property by pretenses and accepted a plea agreement that spared her prison time but carried serious consequences. 24 months of supervised probation, $25,000 in fines, 300 hours of community service, a permanent ban from holding any position in any HOA or nonprofit organization in North Carolina. Rick Flores and Flores Construction were fined $40,000 for bid rigging violations and self-dealing, with a 5-year prohibition on accepting any HOA contracts in the state. The community began healing almost immediately. A special election replaced the dissolved board with new members chosen through a transparent democratic process. Eleanor Vance, at 67 years old, was elected president with 89% of the vote. Her first act was to hire an independent auditor to review all HOA finances. Her second was to oversee the formal removal of the fraudulent Section 14.3 from the CC&Rs, replaced by explicit protections for literal rights holders. The wooden fee booth near the main beach entrance was torn down and replaced with a community bulletin board. Residents who had paid illegal fees received reimbursement checks from the frozen accounts. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, both 78, received $2,400 they had paid over 4 years. Mrs. Williams cried when she opened the envelope. "We thought we had no choice," she told me. "We thought it was the law." On a September morning when the summer heat had finally broken, I walked down the familiar path through the dunes to the cedar gate my grandfather had built more than 60 years before. The foreign padlock was gone, removed by court order. I inserted my family's brass key into the original lock and turned it. The gate swung open with the same gentle creak I remembered from childhood. I stepped onto the sand and walked to the water's edge, letting the cool Atlantic wash over my feet. The beach stretched 800 feet in either direction, every grain of it belonging to my family as it had since 1958. Eleanor found me there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from her kitchen. We sat on the sand together, watching pelicans dive for fish in the morning light. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "He loved this beach more than almost anything." I thought about that for a moment before responding. He taught me that land is not just property. It is a responsibility. Responsibility to protect it and responsibility to protect the people around you. That evening, I opened the fireproof safe and removed my grandfather's deed. The paper had yellowed with age, but his signature remained clear and strong. Beside it lay a photograph I had found years ago, black and white, showing him standing in front of the newly built cedar gate in 1960. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were the words that had guided me through this entire fight. Coal Beach, 1960. For the generations to come. I added a new document to the safe, a copy of the court judgment, proof that the beach remained ours. 6 weeks later, I received an email from a stranger in South Carolina whose HOA had begun collecting similar beach fees. She had found Alexis Peterson's article online and wanted to know how to fight back. I wrote her a detailed response explaining the importance of checking deeds for literal rights, comparing current CC&Rs against originals, requesting financial records, and finding attorneys who specialized in coastal property law. I ended with the words my grandfather might have used. Justice begins with knowing your rights. Documents do not lie. And the ocean will still be there long after the people who tried to steal it are gone.